If you have ever taken a boat through the Thousand Islands and seen turrets rising from the St. Lawrence River, you have seen what George C. Boldt left behind. He was the most powerful hotelier in Gilded Age America, the Prussian-born immigrant who ran the Waldorf Astoria and helped transform luxury hospitality into a profession. He had risen from kitchen work to the trust of the Astor dynasty, from dishwashing to commanding 300 craftsmen, building a 6-story, 120-room castle on a private island for the woman he loved. That castle sat unfinished, open to weather and vandalism, for 73 years, and the man who commissioned it never returned to the island again. How does a man who spent decades making the wealthy feel that the world was under control lose control of the one thing he built for himself? It was January 1904, and the telegram that reached Hart Island carried 6 words that would define the place for the next century. Stop all construction. 300 workers, stonemasons, carpenters, plumbers, electricians, gardeners, men imported from as far as Italy and as near as the villages along the St. Lawrence, had been shaping a 6-story, 120-room Rhineland castle out of the granite and limestone of a small island in the Thousand Islands archipelago of upstate New York. They had been at it for nearly 4 years. The man who employed them was George C. Boldt, the Prussian-born immigrant who had risen from kitchen work to become the most powerful hotelier in America, proprietor of the Waldorf Astoria, architect of modern luxury hospitality, a man whose name was synonymous with the art of making the wealthy feel that they belonged somewhere more important than their own homes. The telegram came because Louise was dead. Louise Augusta Carrier Boldt, his wife of 27 years, had died at their residence on East 87th Street in Manhattan. The public death notice gave no cause. It gave funeral details and nothing else. What it did not give, what no surviving document has ever fully supplied, was the interior of George Boldt's grief. What the record does supply is a single, clean, devastating action. He sent word to the island, he told the workers to leave, and a project that had consumed more than $2.5 million in turn-of-the-century money, a figure sometimes estimated at the equivalent of $5 million or more, though the precise modern conversion remains disputed, went from being the grandest private residence on the St. Lawrence to being nothing at all. Not sold, not repurposed, not finished by another hand. Stopped. The workers put down their tools and left. George Boldt, by all documented accounts, never set foot on Hart Island again. The castle that was meant to be the permanent monument to a marriage sat open to weather, vandalism, and 73 winters of neglect. It became, eventually, one of the most visited historic ruins in the northeastern United States. A tourist attraction built on an act of abandonment. But that is the end of the story. The beginning is a 13-year-old boy arriving in America with nothing but a willingness to work in other people's kitchens. And the distance between those two facts, the immigrant dishwasher and the unfinished castle, is the distance this story has to cross. Georg Karl Boldt was born in Prussia in 1851, into a world that would give him nothing he did not earn by hand. The details of his earliest years are sparse in the historical record. Hotel histories and regional scholarship agree on the broad strokes without filling in the domestic interior. What is known is that he arrived in the United States in 1864, a teenager with no capital, no connections, and no English worth speaking of. He went to work. The jobs were the lowest tier of the hospitality trade. Kitchen help, dishwashing, the invisible labor that kept dining rooms and hotel lobbies functioning while the guests saw none of it. Boldt learned the American service economy from the underside, and what he learned there would matter more than any formal education. He learned that wealth was not merely possessed, it was performed. The mahogany, the silver, the candles, the orchestrated deference of a waiter who remembered your name. All of it was theater, and the people who controlled that theater controlled something more valuable than money. They controlled the feeling of status itself. That insight, that luxury, was an emotional experience, not a material one, would become the engine of everything George Boldt built. But in the 1860s and 1870s, he was still learning the grammar. He moved through kitchens, through hotels, through the invisible apprenticeship of a young immigrant watching how the American upper class liked to be served. And then he found the place that changed the scale of his life. The Philadelphia Club was one of the oldest and most exclusive private clubs in the country. It was the kind of institution where industrial money and inherited money mixed under rules that made both feel distinguished. Boldt came to the club's attention through his work, and the club brought him into the orbit of a man named William Carrer, a member, a man of standing, and the father of a young woman named Louise Augusta Carrer. What happened next was not a fairy tale, though later retellings would try to make it one. George Boldt married Louise in Philadelphia in 1877. He was 26. She came from a world he had been serving, not inhabiting, for over a decade. The marriage was the hinge. not because Louise was wealthy enough to bankroll an empire on her own, but because she brought George Boldt something no amount of kitchen labor could have purchased: proximity to the social world he had been studying from below stairs, and a partner who understood that world from the inside. That partnership is the structural fact that every simplified version of the Boldt Castle legend leaves out. In the popular telling, Louise is the absent wife, the beloved woman for whom the castle was built and who died before she could see it. She is the object of devotion. She is the tragedy. But she was not an object. She was there from the beginning, before the empire existed, before the name Boldt meant anything in American hospitality. And what she brought to the work was not decoration. It was intelligence. With backing from members of the Philadelphia Club, George and Louise Boldt opened the Bellevue Hotel in Philadelphia in 1881. It was their first major property, and what they did with it reveals the creative partnership that the castle legend would later obscure. George built systems. He understood logistics, staffing, the mechanics of running a complex operation at a level of consistency that wealthy guests would trust. Louise understood something harder to systematize. Hotel history sources credit her with helping transform the atmosphere of luxury hotels, bringing in flowers, candles, a softer and more intimate aesthetic that made the Bellevue socially attractive to wealthy women in particular, in an era when the American luxury hotel was still largely a masculine institution, a place of business dinners, political meetings, cigar smoke, and leather. Louise helped make it a place where elite families wanted to spend social time. That contribution matters because it reframes everything that came after. The Boldt hospitality empire was not built by a solitary genius. It was built by two people whose talents interlocked. George could manage a staff of hundreds and keep a complex property running with the precision of a factory. Louise could walk into a dining room and understand what was missing, not in the service, but in the feeling. Together, they were not simply running a hotel. They were inventing a new kind of American social space. The luxury hotel as a domestic theater, a place that felt both grand and personal, where the wealthy could rehearse the version of their lives they most wanted to believe in. The Bellevue became their laboratory. The rituals they developed there, the attention to atmosphere, the cultivation of a guest's sense of being individually recognized, the choreography of arrival and departure and dining that made a hotel stay feel like an event rather than a transaction, would scale up into one of the most consequential careers in the history of American hospitality. And Louise was in the room for all of it, shaping the emotional register while George shaped the infrastructure. This is the correction the documentary owes the record. Boldt Castle was not a rich man's fantasy purchased for a decorative wife. It was a monument built by a man for the woman who had helped him invent the world that made him powerful. The scale of his grief when it came would be incomprehensible without understanding the scale of the collaboration it ended. By the early 1890s, George Boldt's reputation had outgrown Philadelphia. He was brought to New York to manage the Waldorf Hotel, the new luxury property built by William Waldorf Astor on the corner of 5th Avenue and 33rd Street. The Astors were American royalty, the family whose name was shorthand for wealth itself, and the fact that they trusted an immigrant hotelier with their flagship property tells you how far Boldt's methods had traveled. What Boldt walked into was not merely a hotel, it was a family feud made architectural. William Waldorf Astor had built the Waldorf. His cousin, John Jacob Astor IV, would soon build the Astoria next door, a rival property designed to outshine it. The two buildings stood side by side on the same block, monuments to a family quarrel conducted in marble and crystal. Boldt's role was to manage the Waldorf, and then, when the cousins were eventually persuaded to merge, to oversee the combined Waldorf Astoria as a single operation. The merger made the Waldorf Astoria the most famous hotel in the United States, and Boldt made it something more than famous. He made it the central social institution of Gilded Age New York, a place where being seen was as important as being housed, where a dinner reservation carried political weight, and where the rituals of arrival, seating, and service were calibrated to make every guest feel that they had been personally chosen for inclusion in something exclusive. Cornell University's own institutional history remembers Boldt as a trustee who helped merge the properties and turned the combined hotel into a venue significant enough to host university business under his management. Hotel scholarship goes further. Historians of the industry describe him as a man who helped transform innkeeping from a trade into a profession, a figure who understood that the modern luxury hotel was not selling rooms, it was selling belonging. That insight is the thesis of George Boldt's entire career, and it matters because it is also the thesis of the castle. The Waldorf Astoria was a machine for making newly rich Americans feel that their wealth had cultural weight. Boldt Castle was the same machine turned inward. The same logic of atmosphere, ritual, and managed splendor applied not to 1,000 guests a night but to one family, to one marriage, to Louise. The scale of Boldt's influence at his peak is difficult to overstate. His orbit touched not only the Astor dynasty and the New York social world, but institutions like Cornell, where he served as a trustee, and figures as varied as Oscar Tschirky, the legendary maitre d'hotel known as Oscar of the Waldorf, who became a celebrity in his own right under Boldt's management. Even Nikola Tesla moved through the financial world that Boldt's hotels anchored. Tesla's Wardenclyffe laboratory would later be lost to debts entangled with the same networks of Gilded Age capital that Boldt navigated at the top. George Boldt, by the late 1890s, was not merely a successful hotel manager. He was one of the people who had defined what American luxury meant. He had taken the instinct he first developed as a teenage immigrant watching wealthy men dine at the Philadelphia Club, the understanding that status was a performance, and that the person who staged the performance held the real power and turned it into a national institution. He had done it with Louise beside him, shaping the emotional grammar while he built the operational machine. And then he decided to build the performance one more time, not for the public, for her. Construction began on Hart Island in 1900. The island sat in the St. Lawrence River, in the Thousand Islands archipelago, a stretch of water between New York and Ontario that had become, by the turn of the century, a summer retreat for the American wealthy. The Boldts already summered in the region. What George now proposed was something far beyond a summer cottage. The plans called for a full-scale Rhineland-style castle, 6 stories, 120 rooms, designed by the Hewitt Brothers Philadelphia architectural firm. The cost would exceed $2.5 million, an extraordinary sum in 1900, and the figure that later popular accounts would sometimes inflate with varying degrees of accuracy to $5 million or more when adjusted for inflation. The precise modern equivalent is less important than the scale of commitment it represented. This was not an investment. There was no revenue model. It was a gift. 300 workers descended on Hart Island. Stonemasons shaped the exterior walls. Carpenters framed the interior. Electricians wired a building that would have its own power plant. Tunnels were dug beneath the island to carry service and deliveries out of sight, a detail that reveals the hotelier's mind at work even inside a love letter. The island received an Italian garden, a formal entrance arch, a drawbridge, and a structure called the Ulster Tower, a playhouse modeled after a Rhine landmark, intended as a separate entertainment space for the family. Every one of those details carries the signature of the man who built it. The tunnels are the clearest. A private castle does not need service tunnels. A hotel does. George Boldt could not stop being a hotelier, even when the guest list was his own family. The infrastructure of managed perfection, the systems that ensured a guest never saw the labor behind the splendor, followed him from the Waldorf Astoria to the St. Lawrence. Hart Island was not just a castle. It was Boldt's entire philosophy made architectural, the belief that love, like luxury, could be perfected through atmosphere, through the control of every surface, through the elimination of anything unfinished or accidental. Louise and George continued to summer nearby while the work progressed. The castle grew year by year, the walls rising, the gardens taking shape, the powerhouse humming, the Ulster Tower reaching completion. 300 men worked through the building seasons, and the island became a spectacle visible from the river, a monument in progress that announced its own ambition to every boat that passed. By the end of 1903, the project was approaching the stage where the Boldts might have begun to imagine moving in. The structure was not complete, but the shape was there. The turrets, the courtyards, the great hall, the bedroom suites, the views down the river. 4 years of labor and millions of dollars had produced something that looked from the water like a castle that had always been there. What the walls did not know, and what George Boldt could not have managed or designed or staged away, was that the woman for whom every stone had been laid would not live to walk through the front door. Louise A. Boldt died in early January 1904 at the family residence on East 87th Street in Manhattan. She was 53. The public death notice, published in the New York papers, gave the date, the address, and the funeral arrangements. It did not give a cause. No surviving primary document has supplied one with certainty, though later accounts have offered various explanations. Heart failure is the most commonly repeated, but it remains a secondary source claim, not a verified medical record available to the public. What is documented cleanly and without ambiguity is what happened next. George Boldt sent word to Hart Island. The message was to stop all construction, not to pause, not to winterize and resume in spring. To stop. 300 workers received the order. They put down their tools. They left the island. The castle, 6 stories of it, 120 rooms of it, millions of dollars and 4 years of labor sunk into it, sat open. The roof was not finished in every section. Interior work remained incomplete. The Italian gardens were still being shaped. The formal entrance, the service tunnels, the powerhouse, the Ulster Tower playhouse. All of it existed in varying states of completion, and none of it would advance another inch. The stop-work order is the single most important fact in the Boldt Castle story, and it is important to understand what it was and what it was not. It was not a financial decision. George Boldt remained one of the wealthiest hoteliers in America. He could have finished the castle and sold it, donated it, repurposed it as a hotel or a club or a retreat. He could have completed it as a memorial. He did none of those things. The order was not practical. It was absolute. It was the response of a man whose entire life had been organized around the principle that the right environment, perfectly managed, could produce the right feeling, and who had just discovered that the principle had a limit. Louise was the limit. The castle had been built for a living woman, inside a living marriage, as the culmination of a partnership that had lasted 27 years and had produced an empire. Without her, the building had no function that George Boldt was willing to recognize. A hotel could survive the loss of any individual guest. A monument to a specific love could not survive the loss of the person it was for. That distinction is the dark center of George Boldt's life, and it deserves to be stated without sentimentality. This was not a man collapsing into romantic paralysis. This was a man whose operating logic, the logic that had built the Bellevue, merged the Waldorf Astoria, and turned American hospitality into a profession, simply ceased to apply. He had spent decades mastering the art of making spaces feel complete. Hart Island was the one space he could not complete, because completion required the presence of someone who no longer existed. The pattern is architectural. Everything George Boldt had ever built was a finished surface, a hotel lobby, a dining room, a social ritual, designed to make the people inside it feel that the world was under control. Hart Island became the first and only surface he left permanently unfinished. And the unfinished surface said something that no amount of marble or candlelight or orchestrated deference could contradict, that the man who had taught the American wealthy how to inhabit luxury could not, in the end, inhabit his own. The workers who left Hart Island in January 1904 did not come back. No new crew replaced them. No caretaker was installed to maintain the structure against weather and decay. The island, with its half-built castle and its completed outbuildings, was simply left. What followed was not dramatic. It was slow and it was thorough. The St. Lawrence River Valley is not a gentle climate. Winters bring ice, wind, and sustained cold. Rain enters through unfinished roofwork and finds the interior walls. Frost splits stone. Wood rots where moisture sits. A building designed to be heated, maintained, and inhabited. A building whose service tunnels and powerhouse testified to the assumption that a permanent staff would keep it alive, began to die the way any abandoned structure dies, one season at a time. Vandalism accelerated what weather began. Over the decades, the castle became known to locals and to river travelers as an accessible ruin. Windows were broken. Interior fixtures were stripped. Anything portable that had not been removed by the Boldt family was eventually taken by others. The Italian gardens reverted. The landscaping surrendered to the St. Lawrence's own preferences. Hart Island, which had been engineered to present a vision of European permanence on American water, became instead a monument to the speed with which nature reclaims what money builds when money stops caring. 73 years. That is the span between the stop-work order in 1904 and the intervention that finally halted the decay. 73 winters of freeze and thaw. 73 springs of meltwater running through rooms that were supposed to hold Louise Boldt's furniture. The number is not a statistic. It is the physical cost of George Boldt's grief made measurable, not in dollars, but in stone, in the progressive ruin of the grandest thing he ever attempted. The castle during those decades was not invisible. It sat in a major waterway, visible from passing boats, from the Canadian shore, from the bridges that would eventually span the river. It became, over time, a regional landmark of a kind its builder never intended. Not a symbol of love fulfilled, but a symbol of love interrupted, a ruin that tourists pointed at and told each other the story of. The legend simplified with each retelling. A rich man built a castle for his wife. She died. He never finished it. The details of who Louise actually was, what she had contributed, how the partnership had functioned, all of that fell away, leaving behind the clean, sentimental outline that the popular imagination preferred. By the mid-20th century, the castle was in serious structural danger. Walls that had been built to last centuries were failing after decades of exposure. The question was no longer whether the building would survive as a ruin, but whether it would survive at all. George Boldt did not disappear after 1904. That is the quiet paradox at the center of his later years, and it is worth tracing because the popular legend tends to end the man's story at the same moment it ends the castle's. He continued to run the Waldorf Astoria. He continued to oversee a hospitality operation that served thousands of guests and employed hundreds of staff. He continued to sit on the board of trustees at Cornell University, where his name remained associated with the institution's New York connections and its relationship to the hotel industry that he had helped professionalize. The public George Boldt, the man whose name appeared in business directories, trustee lists, and industry records, functioned. Some secondary accounts suggest that he continued to spend summers in the Thousand Islands region, though not on Hart Island itself. That is a narrower and more defensible claim than the popular version, which sometimes asserts that he abandoned the entire area. What the record supports is the specific absence. He did not return to the island. He did not resume work. He did not, as far as any documented source confirms, attempt to sell the property, gift it, or arrange for its maintenance. The institution survived. The private dream did not. And the coexistence of those two facts is the truest portrait of George Boldt's final years. He was not a broken man stumbling through a shattered life. He was a functioning, respected, powerful man who had simply drawn a line around one piece of his existence and sealed it off. The Waldorf Astoria kept running. Hart Island kept decaying. Both things happened simultaneously, in the same life, managed by the same mind that had always understood how to compartmentalize a guest's experience into a seamless surface. The difference was that this time, the compartment contained his own loss. His son, George C. Boldt Jr., grew up in the shadow of that sealed compartment. When the elder Boldt died in Manhattan in 1916, 12 years after Louise, 12 years after the telegram, the younger Boldt inherited the hotel holdings and stepped into the company presidency. The castle was not part of any publicly documented plan for the future. It passed into the family's possession as what it had been since January 1904, an unresolved fact. George Boldt was 65 when he died. He had been an American success story by any conventional measure, an immigrant who had risen to the top of a major industry, who had shaped institutions, who had earned the trust of the wealthiest families in the country. The obituaries and later summaries noted the achievements. They mentioned the castle, if they mentioned it at all, as a curious footnote. The full weight of what Hart Island meant, what it said about the gap between what George Boldt could build for others and what he could not complete for himself, would not become legible for decades, until the ruin itself became famous enough to demand an explanation. In 1977, the Thousand Islands Bridge Authority acquired the Hart Island property. The purchase was not an act of architectural preservation in the traditional sense. It was a pragmatic decision by a regional authority that understood the tourism potential of a ruin with a story attached to it. What TIBA found was a structure that had been open to the elements for 73 years. The restoration effort that followed would eventually consume tens of millions of dollars in repair and capital improvement, a sum that, in its own way, echoed the original construction budget, as though the building demanded to be expensive no matter who owned it. Walls were stabilized, roofs were completed or replaced, interior spaces were made safe for visitors. The work was not an attempt to finish the castle as George Boldt had envisioned it. It was an attempt to arrest the decay and make the ruin visitable. The public came. In the first operating year, 99,000 visitors traveled to Hart Island by boat, the only way to reach it, and walked through the rooms that Louise Boldt never occupied. Attendance would eventually reach a record of 240,000 in a single season. The castle became one of the most visited historic sites in the Thousand Islands region, a destination that drew tourists, wedding parties, and history enthusiasts from across the northeastern United States and from Canada. The irony is structural, and it is the deepest one in the whole story. George Boldt spent his career building spaces designed for public admiration, hotels where the experience of being seen and served and socially validated was the entire product. Hart Island was the one space he built for private life, for the interior of a marriage, for an audience of one. And it is that space, the private one, the unfinished one, the one he abandoned, that became his most public legacy. Millions of people have now visited a place that was never meant for them, walking through doorways that were designed for a woman who died before she could cross them. The castle today is a restored ruin, finished enough to tour, unfinished enough to feel the absence that created it. The Ulster Tower stands, the powerhouse stands, the Italian garden has been partly reclaimed. Visitors arrive by boat, the way the Boldt's guests would have arrived, and they walk through a building that still carries the proportions of its original ambition, even though the interior it was meant to contain, the furniture, the art, the domestic life of a specific family, never materialized. What the tourists come to see, whether they articulate it this way or not, is the gap between what was planned and what was built, between what money could do and what it could not, between the man who controlled every surface of the Waldorf Astoria and the man who could not bring himself to finish a single room on Hart Island after the person it was for was gone. George C. Boldt was two people, and both of them were real. The first was the architect of modern American luxury, the immigrant who arrived with nothing, who learned the choreography of wealth from below stairs, who married a woman who understood the emotional grammar of that world, and who built with her an empire that redefined what a hotel could be. That man was genuine. The Bellevue was genuine. The Waldorf Astoria was genuine. The transformation of innkeeping from a trade into a profession was genuine. The influence on Cornell, on the Astor family's legacy, on the social rituals of Gilded Age New York, all of it was real, documented, and consequential. George Boldt earned his legend. The second was the man who left a castle unfinished on an island in the St. Lawrence River and never went back. That man was also genuine. The telegram was genuine. The 73 years of decay were genuine. The refusal to sell, repurpose, memorialize, or complete the building was genuine. The sealed compartment, the locked room inside the life of a man who had built his career on making rooms feel open and welcoming and alive, was genuine too. Both things were true. The empire and the ruin. The hotelier who could make 1,000 strangers feel personally attended to, and the husband who could not design a way past the death of the one person whose attendance mattered. The man who understood, better than almost anyone in America, that luxury was an emotional experience, and the man who discovered that the one emotional experience he most wanted to create was the one that no amount of atmosphere, management, or money could produce. The popular legend wants to make this a love story, and in one sense it is. George Boldt loved Louise. The evidence of the castle, the evidence of the partnership, the evidence of the stop work order, all of it points in the same direction. But calling it a love story flattens something that the building itself refuses to flatten. Hart Island is not a monument to love. It is a monument to the belief that love could be made permanent through the same methods that made the Waldorf Astoria permanent. Through planning, labor, imported stone, managed surfaces, and the relentless elimination of imperfection. That belief was the engine of George Boldt's genius, and Hart Island was where the engine broke. A hotelier who spent his life perfecting arrival scenes left behind the grandest arrival of his life unfinished at the water's edge. The guests who come now arrive by boat, pay admission, and walk through rooms that exist in a state their builder never intended and could not have tolerated. Open to strangers, incomplete, exposed. They come to see a castle. What they are seeing, whether they know it or not, is the place where certainty failed.